May 27th, 1940. A British captain crouches behind crumbling stone near a French village, watching 5 German soldiers advance through morning fog. In his hands, not a rifle, not a machine gun, a 6-foot medieval longbow. What happens next remained hidden for decades, until now. The German sergeant never saw it coming. The arrow flew silent, faster than sound could travel, and buried deep into his chest. He dropped without a word, without a cry, just gone. The first longbow kill in a European war since the 1600s. The last longbow kill of the entire Second World War. And the man who made that shot? He was just getting started. His name was Jack Churchill. Mad Jack, they called him. And over the next 5 years, he would prove that sometimes the oldest weapons, the oldest tactics, the oldest warrior codes were deadlier than anything modern war could throw at him. See, while the rest of the British Army was running toward Dunkirk, burning documents, throwing away rifles just to move faster toward the coast, Jack Churchill stood his ground, with a bow, with a sword, with bagpipes, and he made the Germans pay for every inch of French soil they thought they owned. This is the story of a man who refused to fight like everyone else, a man who turned psychological warfare into an art form, a man who captured 42 enemy soldiers with nothing but a medieval blade, and a man who, when finally captured by the Nazis, escaped from a concentration camp and walked back to war. But it starts here, in the chaos of 1940, with one British officer who looked at the German war machine and decided a longbow was exactly what he needed. The British Army had no idea what to do with Jack Churchill. He'd graduated from Sandhurst in 1926, served in Burma with the Manchester Regiment, learned everything a proper infantry officer should know. Then, in 1936, he quit. Just walked away. Said peacetime soldiering bored him. Spent the next few years editing newspapers in Kenya, appearing in films, riding motorcycles across India, living like a man who couldn't sit still. When war broke out in September 1939, Churchill rejoined immediately, but he didn't come back alone. He brought his competition longbow, the same one he'd used at the World Archery Championships in Oslo. 26th place out of 63 competitors. Not a champion, no, but good enough to put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. Good enough to kill a man before that man ever heard the shot. He also brought a Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore, the kind his ancestors carried into battle centuries before, and Highland bagpipes, which he'd taught himself to play during those years in Burma. His fellow officers thought he'd lost his mind. His commanding officers thought he was a liability. The War Office had no regulation for officers carrying medieval weapons against panzer divisions. Churchill didn't care what any of them thought, because he understood something that tacticians in London had forgotten. Modern rifles were more accurate at long range, sure. A Mauser could fire 15 rounds per minute, while a longbow could loose maybe 10. But in close combat, in the chaos of an ambush, in the terror of hand-to-hand fighting, psychology mattered as much as firepower. A man charging at you with a broadsword, screaming a Highland war cry, was more terrifying than a man pointing a rifle from cover. And a man who could kill you silently, with an arrow, before you even knew he was there, had an advantage no modern weapon could match. So on May 27, 1940, when that German patrol advanced through the mist near Le Pignette, Jack Churchill drew his bow, 70 pounds of tension, 200 yards effective range in expert hands. The sergeant fell, silent, instant, and the Germans scattered, confused, terrified, because what they'd just witnessed made no sense in their world of rifles and grenades. Churchill covered his company's retreat that day, used that bow, used his sword, played his bagpipes to rally men who'd forgotten they could still fight. And when the British Expeditionary Force evacuated from Dunkirk, most came home defeated, exhausted, expecting invasion within weeks. Jack Churchill came home with his bow, his sword, his bagpipes, and a confirmed kill that belonged in a museum. He was just getting started. Within weeks of Dunkirk, Churchill volunteered for a new unit. They called themselves Commandos. The training would be brutal. The missions would be suicide raids into Nazi-occupied territory. Casualty rates were expected to be catastrophic. Churchill requested permission to bring his sword and bow on operations. The Commandos said yes. They trained in Scotland, in the mountains around Auchnacarry Castle. 30-mile marches carrying full equipment, amphibious landings in freezing water, learning to kill silently with knives, garrots, bare hands, live ammunition fired over their heads during exercises. Men who couldn't keep up were sent back in disgrace. Churchill excelled at everything. He was older than most volunteers, but stronger, more determined. He could march longer, shoot straighter, fight harder than men 10 years younger, and he brought skills no other commando possessed. The other men didn't know what to make of him at first. Some thought he was showing off. Others thought he was insane. But as training progressed, they began to understand his logic. War wasn't just about killing. War was about fear, about psychology. A German soldier facing a rifle knew what to expect. He'd trained against rifles. He understood the threat. But a German soldier facing a screaming man with a sword and bagpipes had no training for that. His mind would freeze for a critical second while he tried to process what he was seeing. And in combat, a second of hesitation meant death. By autumn 1941, Churchill had been promoted to second in command of No. 3 Commando. They had conducted small raids along the Norwegian coast, but nothing significant. Then, in November, the order came down. No. 3 Commando would lead a major assault on Vågsøy, a German-held island controlling access to fjords the Nazis used to transport iron ore from Sweden. The operation was codenamed Archery. The garrison numbered around 150 German soldiers with coastal artillery, anti-aircraft batteries, fortified positions. The plan called for a dawn assault on December 27th. Royal Navy cruisers would bombard the positions. RAF bombers would provide cover. Then the commandos would land on multiple beaches simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders before they could organize. Churchill studied the intelligence obsessively. The Germans were well-trained, well-equipped, dug in. The coastal guns could sink landing craft before they reached shore. The attack had to be fast, violent, overwhelming. He requested permission to lead the first wave onto Molina Island, a fortified position guarding the approach. Permission granted. He requested permission to carry his sword and play his bagpipes during the assault. Permission granted, though several senior officers questioned his sanity. The night before the raid, Churchill checked his equipment one final time. Broadsword sharp, bagpipes tuned, grenades, revolver, Thompson submachine gun as backup, but he intended to lead the charge with steel and music, not bullets. The commandos loaded onto transport ships on Christmas Day, 1941. They sailed north through Arctic darkness into the Norwegian Sea. Temperature dropped below freezing. Ice formed on deck railings. Men huddled in their quarters, checking weapons, writing letters home, trying not to think about what was coming. Churchill spent the voyage studying maps, rehearsing signals with his men. He had 105 commandos under his direct command. Their objective? Neutralize the German shore battery on Molina within 10 minutes of landing. If they failed, the entire operation would collapse. German artillery would destroy the landing craft. Hundreds of British soldiers would die in freezing water. At 0845 on December 27th, the landing craft reached their launch position 12 miles off the Norwegian coast. The commandos climbed down cargo nets in full combat gear. Churchill took his position in the bow of the lead craft, bagpipes in hand, sword at his belt. In 90 minutes, he would either be dead or legendary. The landing craft approached Maolau through a curtain of smoke. RAF bombers had dropped smoke canisters to blind the German gunners. HMS Kenya was firing 6-inch guns at the shore battery. Explosions lit up the Norwegian coast like lightning. Churchill stood in the bow, fully exposed to enemy fire. His men crouched behind steel gunnels, but his commander remained standing, bagpipes inflated and ready. The shore was 200 yards away, then 150, then 100. At 0848, the ramp dropped onto rocky beach. Before any of his men could move, Churchill stepped forward into freezing surf and began playing the March of the Cameron Men. The sound of bagpipes cut through explosions and gunfire like a blade through cloth. It was the most Scottish sound in the world, coming from a beach in Nazi-occupied Norway. The Germans in the shore battery heard it and couldn't believe what they were hearing. They'd been trained to fight British soldiers with rifles and grenades. They had not been trained to fight a madman playing music while walking calmly toward their guns. Churchill finished the tune, set down his bagpipes, pulled a grenade from his belt and hurled it at the nearest German position. Then he drew his broadsword and charged up the beach, screaming at his men to follow. The assault on Maolau took less than 10 minutes. Churchill led his men through German positions systematically, clearing bunkers and gun emplacements one by one. The 4 coastal artillery guns were destroyed with explosive charges. The anti-aircraft battery was overrun. The German commander was taken prisoner along with 15 of his men. Churchill emerged without a scratch. His sword had blood on it. His bagpipes were undamaged. His reputation was made. The raid on Vågsøy was the first major commando success of the war. It proved small, highly trained forces could strike deep into enemy territory and inflict serious damage. It proved aggressive tactics and psychological warfare could overcome fortified positions. And it proved Jack Churchill's medieval methods were not madness. They were effective. The German High Command was furious. Hitler himself issued orders strengthening coastal defenses throughout Norway. 30,000 additional troops diverted to garrison duty, troops that could have been fighting in Russia or North Africa. A single raid by 300 commandos had tied down an entire army. Word of Churchill's exploits spread through the British military. The officer who played bagpipes into battle, the madman with the broadsword. Newspapers ran stories. Commanders requested him for operations. The War Office stopped questioning his equipment choices. By summer 1943, Churchill had been promoted to commanding officer of No. 2 Commando. His next mission would take him to Sicily, to Italy, and to the most audacious prisoner capture of the entire war. 42 Germans were about to learn that surrendering to a man with a sword was better than dying on his blade. The Allied invasion of Sicily began July 9, 1943, Operation Husky. 160,000 troops from Britain, America, Canada landing on the southern coast within 3 days. The objective? Knock Italy out of the war and open a second front against Nazi Germany. No. 2 Commando landed at Catania on the eastern coast under Churchill's command. He came ashore carrying his complete arsenal: Scottish broadsword around his waist, longbow and arrows slung across his back, bagpipes tucked under his arm. His men no longer questioned his equipment choices. They'd seen what he could do at Vågsøy. They trusted him completely. The fighting in Sicily was brutal. Germans had reinforced the Italian garrison with elite parachute troops and panzer divisions. Every village became a fortress, every road an ambush site. The Allies advanced slowly, taking casualties at every step. Churchill led his commandos through mountainous terrain, bypassing enemy strongpoints, striking supply lines, gathering intelligence. By September, Sicily had fallen, and the Allies were preparing to invade mainland Italy. The plan called for landings at Salerno, south of Naples. Intelligence suggested the Germans were expecting attack further north near Rome. Salerno beaches would be lightly defended. The invasion would be straightforward. The intelligence was wrong. No. 2 Commando landed at Salerno on September 9, 1943. They immediately encountered fierce resistance. Germans had anticipated the invasion, reinforced the area with panzers and artillery. The beachhead came under heavy fire within hours. The entire operation was in danger of collapsing. Churchill's commandos were assigned to defend a critical junction at the town of Vietri sul Mare, overlooking the western half of Salerno Bay. If Germans captured Vietri, they could pour artillery fire onto Allied beaches. The landing force would be destroyed. For 5 consecutive days, Churchill and his men held Vietri against repeated German counterattacks. They fought from buildings, from ditches, from rubble, repelled infantry assaults and tank probes, called in naval gunfire, refused to give ground even when ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. On the night of September 14th, Churchill received new orders. German forces had occupied hills above the town of Molina, controlling a strategic pass leading down to Salerno. An observation post on those hills was directing artillery fire onto Allied positions. The observation post had to be eliminated. Churchill studied the terrain. A frontal assault would be suicidal. Germans had machine guns covering every approach, mortars zeroed in on obvious routes. Any large force would be detected and destroyed. He decided on a different approach. He would take a single corporal and infiltrate German positions at night. 2 men could move silently where 200 could not. 2 men could capture what 200 could not take by force. Churchill and the corporal left British lines after midnight. They moved through darkness using terrain for cover, avoided German sentries by crawling through drainage ditches along stone walls. The night was black. Germans weren't expecting attack from 2 men armed with a sword and a revolver. They reached the first German position just before dawn. Churchill spotted the glow of cigarettes in darkness. German soldiers manning a mortar position, relaxed, not expecting trouble. Churchill drew his broadsword and approached silently. He appeared out of darkness like a ghost from another century. The Germans surrendered immediately. They'd never seen anything like this officer with his medieval weapon and calm demeanor. Churchill used his revolver lanyard as rope to lead the first prisoner to the next position. He repeated the process, each time approaching silently, revealing himself suddenly, demanding surrender. Each time the Germans complied, too shocked to resist. By dawn, Churchill and his corporal had captured 42 German soldiers and an entire mortar squad. They marched their prisoners back down the path to British lines. Wounded Germans were placed on carts, pushed by their fellow prisoners. Churchill later described the scene as an image from the Napoleonic Wars. He received the Distinguished Service Order for the action at Molina. The citation praised his courage, initiative, leadership. It did not mention he'd accomplished the entire capture with a sword. Some things were too unusual, even for official military records. The Salerno beachhead was secured by September 20th. The Allies began their long advance up the Italian peninsula toward Rome. Churchill and his commandos continued operating ahead of the main force, raiding German positions, capturing prisoners, disrupting communications. His reputation had spread beyond the British military. German soldiers began telling stories about the British officer with the sword and bagpipes. They called him a madman, a berserker, a throwback to an earlier age. Some refused to believe he was real. Others hoped they'd never encounter him in battle. By spring 1944, the war in Italy had become a grinding stalemate. Germans held high ground along the Gustav Line. The Allies needed to open new fronts to stretch German resources thin. Churchill received orders transferring No. 2 Commando to Yugoslavia. They would support partisan fighters against German occupation forces. The mission would be dangerous, the terrain brutal, and the Germans would be waiting for the madman with the sword. The Germans in Yugoslavia had heard the stories about Jack Churchill long before he arrived. Intelligence reports circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters describing the British officer who carried a sword and played bagpipes in combat. Some officers dismissed the reports as propaganda. Others took them seriously. All of them underestimated what Churchill was capable of doing. By spring 1944, Yugoslavia had become one of the most brutal theaters of the war. German occupation forces controlled cities and major roads, but partisan communist partisans under Joseph Tito dominated mountains and forests. The fighting was savage. Prisoners rarely taken on either side. Entire villages destroyed in reprisal attacks. Germans had deployed over 500,000 troops to Yugoslavia and were still losing ground. The British government decided to support Tito's partisans with weapons, supplies, and military advisors. Commandos would provide direct combat support for partisan operations. Churchill and No. 2 Commando were transferred to the Adriatic island of Vis in April 1944. From there, they'd launch raids against German positions along the Dalmatian coast. Churchill threw himself into the mission with characteristic enthusiasm, studied terrain, learned partisan tactics, planned operations against German supply lines. The partisans were impressed by his aggression, his willingness to fight alongside them. The Germans were about to learn the madman with the sword had arrived in their sector. The first raids were successful. Churchill led attacks on German outposts, destroying equipment, capturing prisoners. He moved through mountains with his sword and bagpipes, inspiring partisans with his fearlessness. Germans responded by reinforcing garrisons, increasing patrols. They knew something had changed. The raids were more coordinated, more aggressive, more effective. In May 1944, Churchill received orders to capture the German-held island of Brač. The island controlled shipping lanes along the Dalmatian coast. A German garrison of several hundred soldiers held fortified positions overlooking beaches. Taking Brač would require a major assault. Churchill assembled his force, 43 commandos from No. 43 Commando, a troop from No. 40 Commando, approximately 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. It was a mixed force with mixed capabilities. British commandos were highly trained professionals. Partisans were brave but poorly equipped, loosely disciplined. Coordinating them in a complex amphibious assault would be difficult. The landing on Brač was unopposed. Germans had pulled back from beaches to prepare defensive positions in hills. Churchill landed with his men on the night of May 2, 1944. The partisans were supposed to advance immediately toward German positions. Instead, they hesitated. Partisan commanders saw the strength of German fortifications and decided to wait until morning. Churchill was furious. Delay gave Germans time to reinforce, time to prepare, time to call for support. But he couldn't force partisans to attack. He had to wait through the long night, knowing surprise had been lost. The assault began the following morning. No. 43 Commando launched a flanking attack, while Churchill led elements from No. 40 in a direct assault. The partisans remained at the landing area, providing no support. Churchill and his commandos were on their own. The Germans were ready. Machine gun fire swept approaches to hilltop positions. Mortar rounds exploded among advancing commandos. Churchill pushed forward anyway, bagpipes playing, sword at his side, urging his men up the slope. The assault stalled. Men were falling, ammunition running low. A German mortar team had zeroed in on Churchill's position. They fired a salvo of rounds directly into the group of commandos gathered around their commander. The explosions killed or wounded every man except Churchill himself. He survived only because he'd been standing slightly apart, playing his bagpipes to encourage the attack. Churchill found himself alone on a hillside in enemy territory. His men dead or dying around him, Germans advancing toward his position, ammunition exhausted, escape impossible. He did what any officer of his character would do. He sat down on a rock, picked up his bagpipes, and began playing "Will Ye No Come Back Again." It was a Scottish lament, a song of farewell, a final act of defiance against an enemy that had finally caught up with him. The Germans approached cautiously. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. A British officer, surrounded by bodies, playing music while they pointed rifles at him. They didn't shoot. Too confused, too curious, perhaps too respectful of a man who faced death with such composure. A German grenade exploded near Churchill, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, he was a prisoner. The Germans transported Churchill to Berlin for interrogation. They were convinced anyone named Churchill must be related to the British Prime Minister. They flew him to the capital under heavy guard, hoping to extract valuable intelligence about Allied plans. They were disappointed. Jack Churchill had no connection to Winston Churchill. He wasn't privy to strategic secrets. He was simply an officer who liked swords and bagpipes. The Germans sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin, a special compound for prominent prisoners, politicians, resistance leaders, suspected relatives of important figures. Churchill was placed among men who'd plotted against Hitler, men who defied the Nazi regime, men who expected to be executed at any moment. For most prisoners, Sachsenhausen was the end. For Jack Churchill, it was merely an inconvenience. Within 4 months, he would escape. Within 8 months, he'd be fighting again. The Germans had captured the madman with the sword, but they hadn't broken him. Sachsenhausen wasn't designed for men like Jack Churchill. The camp held political prisoners, resistance fighters, enemies of the Nazi state. Most inmates spent their days in forced labor, slowly starving under brutal conditions. Many never left alive. SS guards expected obedience, despair, eventual death from their prisoners. Churchill gave them none of these things. He was placed in a special compound called Sonderlager A, reserved for prominent prisoners who might have value as hostages or bargaining chips. His fellow inmates included diplomats, politicians, military officers, suspected relatives of Allied leaders. Among them were 3 Royal Air Force officers who'd participated in the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III in March 1944. 50 of their comrades had been executed by the Gestapo after that escape. These 3 survived only because they were considered potentially valuable. Churchill immediately began planning his own escape. He studied camp layout, guard rotations, fence lines, watchtower positions, identified weaknesses in the perimeter, recruited allies among fellow prisoners. Within weeks, he had a plan. The prisoners in Sonderlager A had access to a small garden area near the perimeter fence. Churchill and his conspirators began digging a tunnel from a drainage ditch in the garden. They worked at night, concealing excavated dirt under piles of compost, used spoons, pieces of metal, bare hands to claw through earth. The tunnel extended 110 meters, passing under the fence, emerging in a wooded area beyond camp perimeter. On September 23, 1944, Churchill and 4 other British officers crawled through the tunnel to freedom. They emerged into darkness beyond Sachsenhausen and scattered into the German countryside. Churchill paired with squadron leader Bertram James, one of the Great Escape survivors. Their plan: walk north to the Baltic coast, approximately 200 kilometers away, and find a boat to neutral Sweden. For 2 weeks, Churchill and James moved through Nazi Germany on foot, traveled at night, hid during the day, stole vegetables from fields, drank from streams, avoided roads, towns, anywhere Germans might spot 2 ragged men who didn't speak the language. Weather was turning cold, their clothes inadequate. No maps, no compass, no supplies beyond what they could steal. They made it to within a few kilometers of the Baltic coast before their luck ran out. A German patrol spotted them near the town of Rostock and demanded identification. Churchill and James had none. They were arrested, interrogated, identified as escaped prisoners from Sachsenhausen. The Germans returned them to captivity, but not to Sachsenhausen. Churchill was transferred to a camp in Austria, deep in the Alps, far from any Allied lines. The war was clearly turning against Germany by late 1944. Soviets advancing from the east, Allies pushing through France toward the Rhine. But for a prisoner in an Austrian mountain camp, liberation seemed impossibly distant. Churchill spent the winter of 1944–45 as a prisoner, watched as Germany collapsed around him. Allied bombers flew overhead daily. News filtered in about Soviet advances, about the fall of Berlin, about Hitler's increasingly desperate orders. Guards became nervous, uncertain, aware they might soon face justice for their crimes. In late April 1945, Churchill and approximately 140 other prominent prisoners were transferred from Austria to the Tyrol region of Italy. The SS planned to use them as hostages, bargaining chips in negotiations with advancing Allies. Prisoners were marched through the mountains under heavy guard, not knowing if they'd be released or executed. The end came unexpectedly. A delegation of prisoners approached senior Wehrmacht officers and expressed their fear of being murdered by the SS. The officers listened. A German army unit commanded by Captain Richard von Alvensleben moved in to protect the prisoners. Wehrmacht soldiers outnumbered SS Grads. After a tense standoff, the SS withdrew. The prisoners were abandoned in a small Italian village, free but stranded in enemy territory. Most liberated prisoners waited for Allied forces to arrive. Jack Churchill did not wait. He'd been a prisoner for nearly a year. He'd escaped once, been recaptured, survived. He was not going to sit in a village while there was still a war to fight. Churchill began walking south toward Allied lines, covered 150 kilometers on foot through the Italian Alps, crossing mountain passes, avoiding German stragglers. His ankle was injured. He had no food, no weapons, no identification. He walked anyway. After 8 days, he reached the town of Verona and encountered an American armored reconnaissance unit. The Americans didn't know what to make of the ragged British officer who appeared out of the mountains claiming to be a commando lieutenant colonel. Churchill had no documents, no uniform insignia, nothing to prove his identity. He convinced them by sheer force of personality, by the authority in his voice, by the stories he told of swords and bagpipes and German prisoners captured at knife point. The Americans sent him back to Britain through military channels. Churchill arrived home in May 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending. Germany had surrendered, concentration camps being liberated, fighting in Europe over. But the war was not over. Japan was still fighting in the Pacific. Thousands of British soldiers still dying in Burma, Malaya, the islands of Southeast Asia. Churchill immediately requested transfer to the Far East. He wanted to fight the Japanese, wanted to carry his sword into one more battle, play his bagpipes on one more beach, prove the old ways of war still had meaning in the modern age. The War Office approved his request. By summer 1945, Jack Churchill was on a ship heading east, toward Burma, toward Japan, toward what he hoped would be the final chapter of his war. He had no way of knowing that 2 atomic bombs were about to change everything. Jack Churchill was somewhere over India when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. August 6, 1945. A single American B-29 bomber dropped a weapon that killed 80,000 people in an instant. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The Second World War was over. Churchill received the news with bitter disappointment. He'd spent months preparing for the invasion of Japan, studied Japanese tactics, fortifications, fighting spirit, planned to lead commandos onto Japanese beaches with his sword and bagpipes, just as he'd done in Norway, Sicily, Yugoslavia. Now there would be no invasion, no final battle, no chance to test himself against one more enemy. His reaction became legendary among those who served with him. He reportedly complained that without the American atomic bombs, the war could have continued for another 10 years. It was a dark joke, but it revealed something true about Churchill's character. He was a man who thrived in combat, who found meaning in the chaos of war, who felt most alive when death was closest. Peace was a foreign country to him. The British military didn't know what to do with Jack Churchill after the war ended. He was too aggressive for peacetime garrison duty, too eccentric for staff positions, too famous to ignore. His service record was extraordinary. Distinguished Service Order with a bar, Military Cross with a bar, mentioned in dispatches multiple times. He'd fought in France, Norway, Sicily, Italy, Yugoslavia, escaped from a concentration camp, captured 42 prisoners with a sword. The War Office assigned him to administrative duties in Burma, helping oversee the transition from war to peace. Churchill found the work tedious, no patience for paperwork, no interest in bureaucracy, no talent for the diplomatic compromises peacetime required. He requested transfers to active units, volunteered for dangerous assignments, looked for any opportunity to return to the kind of soldiering he understood. By 1946, the British Empire was collapsing, India demanding independence, Palestine descending into chaos, colonial territories across Africa and Asia stirring with nationalist movements. The world Churchill had fought to defend was transforming into something unrecognizable. Churchill was transferred to Palestine in 1947 as second in command of the 1st Battalion Highland Light Infantry. The situation was explosive. Jewish refugees from the Holocaust flooding into the territory, demanding a homeland. Arab Palestinians resisting what they saw as an invasion. British soldiers caught in the middle, trying to maintain order while both sides attacked them. Violence escalated throughout 1947 and into 1948. Jewish militant groups bombed British installations. Arab fighters ambushed Jewish convoys. The British announced they'd withdraw from Palestine in May 1948, leaving the two sides to fight it out. Everyone knew a full-scale war was coming. On April 13, 1948, a convoy of Jewish medical personnel was ambushed on the road to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. The convoy carried doctors, nurses, students, patients. Arab fighters attacked with rifles and Molotov cocktails. British security forces in the area failed to intervene effectively. 77 people were killed in what became known as the Hadassah Convoy Massacre. Churchill wasn't at the massacre site, but he was involved in the aftermath. The surviving Jewish medical staff at Hadassah Hospital were now trapped on Mount Scopus, surrounded by hostile territory. They couldn't leave safely, couldn't receive supplies, faced the prospect of slow starvation or violent death. Churchill organized the evacuation. He coordinated with British military units, Jewish authorities, Arab leaders to arrange safe passage for trapped personnel. He personally oversaw the operation, moving through contested areas with the same calm authority he'd shown on battlefields across Europe. 700 Jewish doctors, students, patients were evacuated from Mount Scopus under his protection. When asked later about his approach to the dangerous negotiations, Churchill offered a characteristically simple explanation. People were less likely to shoot at someone who was smiling at them. It was the same psychology he'd applied throughout his military career. Confidence, composure, refusal to show fear could accomplish what firepower could not. Churchill left Palestine shortly before British withdrawal in May 1948. The State of Israel was declared, the Arab-Israeli War began. The violence Churchill had witnessed was only the beginning of a conflict that would continue for decades. He returned to Britain with his military career winding down. He was 41 years old, he'd fought in one World War and several smaller conflicts, earned decorations from multiple nations, survived experiences that would have killed most men 10 times over, and he had no idea what to do with the rest of his life. The British Army offered him training assignments, staff positions, administrative roles. Churchill accepted them without enthusiasm. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40s, jumping from aircraft just to feel the rush of adrenaline again. He trained new generations of soldiers in commando tactics, passing on skills he'd learned in Scotland and applied across Europe. But peacetime soldiering could never match the intensity of war. Churchill needed something else, some new challenge, some way to feel alive again. He found it in the most unlikely place imaginable. On July 21, 1955, a 48-year-old British Army officer stood on the banks of the River Severn in Gloucestershire, England. He was holding a homemade surfboard, watching the water for signs of the tidal bore, a wave that traveled up the river from the Bristol Channel twice each day. Local fishermen thought he was mad. They'd seen waves on the Severn for generations, but no one had ever tried to ride one. Jack Churchill paddled out into the brown water and waited. The bore appeared as a white line on the horizon, moving upstream against the current. Not a large wave by ocean standards, perhaps 5 feet at its peak, but it was a wave, and Churchill was determined to ride it. He caught the bore and surfed it for over a mile upstream, becoming one of the first people in Britain to ride a river wave. It was exactly the kind of absurd, unnecessary, slightly dangerous activity that had defined his entire life. He wasn't content to watch the wave pass. He had to be on it, had to feel it beneath him, had to master it the way he'd mastered the longbow, the broadsword, the bagpipes. Churchill retired from the British Army in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He'd served for over 30 years, fought in one World War and several smaller conflicts, earned decorations from multiple nations, survived experiences that would have killed most men 10 times over. He was 52 years old and finally at peace with civilian life. His retirement was as eccentric as his military career. He developed a passion for radio-controlled model boats, building elaborate warships and sailing them on ponds near his home. He refurbished old steamboats and piloted them along the Thames between Richmond and Oxford. He continued to play bagpipes at memorial ceremonies and regimental gatherings, a living connection to the commando traditions he'd helped create. His daily commute became legendary among fellow train passengers. Churchill would ride the train home from London each evening, and as the train passed his neighborhood, he'd open the window and throw his briefcase out onto the tracks. Startled passengers assumed he had lost his mind. In fact, Churchill had calculated the exact spot where his garden bordered the railway line. The briefcase landed in his backyard every time, saving him the trouble of carrying it from the station. When people asked about his wartime exploits, Churchill was modest. He didn't boast about Germans he'd killed or prisoners he'd captured, didn't exaggerate his role or claim credit for victories that belonged to others. He simply told the truth, which was extraordinary enough without embellishment. His son Malcolm later recalled that his father would discuss the war openly with anyone who asked, particularly over a glass of wine in the evening, but he never sought attention for his deeds. The years passed. Churchill watched the world change around him. The British Empire dissolved, the Cold War divided Europe, new technologies transformed warfare beyond recognition. Guided missiles replaced artillery, jet aircraft replaced propeller planes, nuclear weapons made conventional combat seem almost quaint. The kind of war Churchill had fought, with swords and bagpipes and personal courage, became a historical curiosity. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. He'd outlived most of his comrades from the commandos, most of his fellow prisoners from Sachsenhausen, most of the men he'd led into battle across Europe. He died peacefully in Surrey, England, surrounded by family, a lifetime removed from the frozen beaches of Norway and the burning hills of Yugoslavia. The obituaries struggled to capture his life. One British newspaper wrote that if Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. No fictional hero with his story would seem credible. A man who killed enemies with a longbow in the age of tanks. A man who captured prisoners with a sword in the age of machine guns. A man who played bagpipes while mortars were exploding around him. A man who escaped from a Nazi concentration camp and walked 150 kilometers to freedom. A man who surfed river waves and threw briefcases from trains and refused to accept that the modern world had no place for medieval warriors. Jack Churchill was not the most decorated soldier of the Second World War. He wasn't the most successful commander or the most brilliant tactician. He didn't win any decisive battles or change the course of history through strategic genius. What he did was simpler and perhaps more important. He proved that individual courage still mattered. He proved that unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower. He proved that one man with enough determination could accomplish what armies could not. His legacy lives on in the commandos he helped create, in the special operations forces that trace their lineage to those Scottish training grounds, in every soldier who's ever been told something was impossible and refused to believe it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about officers who captured prisoners with swords. Stories about soldiers who played bagpipes under mortar fire. Stories about men who escaped concentration camps and walked across mountains to fight again. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Norway? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you had ever heard of Mad Jack Churchill before today. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jack Churchill does not disappear into silence. This man deserved to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.